so. Second, all of you are muted except the presenters. So if you have a question or a comment, please use the chat function in the GoToTraining toolbar, and you should see this either on the right side of your screen or below the screen. And then finally, our agenda for today is that we will hear a refresher and overview of implicit bias, and then we'll hear about what educators have learned about taking effective steps to dismantle implicit bias, and then we will open for questions at the end. But however, please don't wait to ask your question using the chat function. I will be jotting down and taking notes and making sure that we get as many questions as possible answered. And so I think without any further ado, we will turn it over to Chris and Zabrina.
Well, thank you, Sarah. We appreciate it. So as Sarah mentioned, we're just going to primarily do a quick refresher. From what we understand, everybody on the call are almost professional implicit bias practitioners and thought leaders. So we're just going to provide a little bit of an update, or rather review, of kind of the basic principles around implicit bias, and then we're going to pass the baton on to Jason. So next slide, please. So often we kind of lead with this quote, which is, we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. And that kind of relates to the ways in which our lens can impact the way in which things are actually happening within the world, or at least how we perceive them. Next slide. Next. Next slide.
Sorry, it seems like there's a little bit of a delay. I've advanced the slides, but it seems like it might not be advancing for you. Okay.
No worries.
Can you see? Okay. Are you seeing the next slide?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So for everybody that's on the line, if you would play or participate in this little activity with us, we want you to keep the following words in mind. They're going to be 10 words. However, please do not write them down or jot them down anywhere. Just try to memorize them. So we're going to go through the slides one at a time. Next. All right. Now, if you would, please try to remember those slides, because we're definitely going to come back a little bit later on in the presentation and revisit those slides. Next. So this slide is talking about whether or not what we see is actually what we see. If folks could, and I believe there's a poll that's going to be available to you all to take, but if you guys could mark down whether or not you think the slide, or you think the faces are actually getting darker as you move from the left to the right, or if you think they're getting darker as you move from the right to the left. And if you're uncertain, you can pick the third category. And if you could go back to that slide.
So we're going to let people answer the question, and then I think they'll be able to see the slide again. And it seems that almost 80% of folks have answered the question, so I'll give people a little bit longer to answer. All right, so I have
Great, thank you. So usually when I show this slide, I'm actually doing it in front of a live audience, and I ask folks to kind of raise their hand if they think it's getting darker from left to right, and usually there's a few people who raise their hand. And if I ask whether or not they think it's actually getting darker from the right to the left, more people usually raise their hand. In actuality, the the color change is not happening at all. This is kind of referred to as the equal reflectance test. Oh, and we have results. So we were able to fool some of you. All of the images on that screen have the same color lightness. However, the actual person, the actual individuals, the faces, have different phenotypical features that impact whether or not we think or perceive ourselves to be seeing somebody who's darker skinned or lighter skinned. And so if you look to the left, you see somebody with more stereotypically African phenotypic features. If you look to the right side, you see somebody who looks more like Caucasian or having Caucasian features. And so that is an example of the ways in which our eyes can actually trick ourselves, our stereotypes, our learned belief that African people who are African, dark, black, have certain phenotypical features like a nose or a mouth that more readily appears with African folks or people of African descent. And the same for white people. So this is again called the equal reflectance test. It's a way in which researchers are able to kind of play with our perception and impact the way in which, or question the ways in which we view what we are seeing in the world. So this next study took that last study a little bit further. It's called the Correll study, and it was basically the shooter bias test. And in this test, as you see the two images on the bottom of the screen, there were several images that were provided for participants of the study to decide whether or not they saw an individual that was holding a weapon or holding a phone or some other item in their hand. And they were asked or questioned whether or not they would shoot if they saw an armed person, or if they saw a person holding a phone, then they would choose the selection or the button choice not to shoot. Overwhelmingly, it was found that more individuals shot unarmed black people in this study. About 80% of the participants shot unarmed black people than they shot armed white people in this study. So this was the Correll study. It was the shooter bias study, and basically showed the biases in which we have perceptions and stereotypes around who is more likely to hold a gun in their hand. And so if we're perceiving the African person on the left as within our view, our range of view, then we may be more likely to assume or stereotypically think that person's carrying a weapon based off of a lot of other environmental factors that have impacted or influenced our stereotypes and perception. Next. So the top 4 things that you want to know. Your mind plays tricks on you. Overt racism is giving way to implicit bias and structural racism. Implicit bias has an undeniable impact on our policies and decisions. And lastly, you can recognize your own biases and take steps to counteract them. And so Zabrina is going to talk a little bit about that last piece, and Jason's going to go into more detail about it. But to provide more of a review of the basic understanding of implicit bias, the general definition is as follows. Implicit or unconscious bias refers to stereotypes or attitudes that operate without an individual actually being consciously aware of those biases. So these attitudes are impacted by stereotypes, and these stereotypes can impact our thoughts, our actions, and decisions on how we move and operate in the world. For example, with the shooter bias test or study. Next slide. So, as many of you are aware, a group of scientists out of Harvard created the IAT, or implicit association test, to try and measure the relative strength or association between target concepts like race and an attributive concept like good or bad. And the more strongly a test taker associates two concepts, the faster and more accurately he or she can pair them together. Next. So what researchers were able to gather from these IATs, and they did several different types of IAT tests, so one based off ethnicity, gender, nationality, race, weight, age. Researchers were able to show implicit biases to a broad range of historically disadvantaged groups with respect to those characteristics. So in the gender IAT, 76% of participants more readily associated males with career and females with family. With gender science IAT, 70% more readily associate male with science and female with the arts. On the race IAT, 75% of participants had an implicit preference for white people over black people. And on the disability IAT, 76% of respondents had an implicit preference for able-bodied people. Next. So implicit racial biases can impact the ways in which we form mental connections between ethnic groups and certain characteristics. So for example, if you see an African American, you might more readily associate that with criminality or laziness or unintelligence or aggression based off of those biases. Same with Latinos. You might associate criminality, aggression, or immigrant status with Latinos. And so this is a way in which our biases can just happen and interact and form these kind of connections without us necessarily trying or wanting to do that. Next. So psychological studies have shown that children develop an adult-like understanding of race around age 5. Associations about the characteristics associated with people of each race develop soon after. And a study found that around 80% of children had already developed pro-white, anti-black sentiments by age 6. So we're not going to show you the video now, but I'm sure some of you may already be familiar with the doll test that shows the reaction with young children, around the ages of 5 and 6 years of age, who are being asked a series of questions about whether or not one doll, a white doll, looks better or worse than a black doll. And repeatedly, there were responses by children of color stating that the white doll was more attractive or more pretty or more associated with good or positive characteristics. And the African doll or the black doll was more readily associated with bad or negative or less pretty or less attractive and less intelligent. And interestingly enough, another question also came out, which is asking the recipients, well, which doll looks most like you? And these young black children would readily say, it looks like me, and with regard to the black doll. Next. So I want you to kind of pay attention to these images that you're seeing now and think about how you feel when you're looking at them. Personally, I am not too fond of spiders. Next. I can probably handle snakes, but only at a far distance. Next. So as you were looking at those images, you might have felt a little anxious or nervous, especially if you envision seeing them right in front of you. You might have noticed that your heart might be beating faster, your blood pressure might increase. Next. Now this image, to me, is a very cute dog. I want it. Next slide. I'm getting a couple of laughs from people in my office, so that's great. So when we are afraid, our bodies undergo a series of physiological changes that ready us for basically the fight or flight response. And these responses can be very quick. Scientists estimate that it can take less than 1/10 of a second for you to react once you've been exposed to something that you fear. And to be frightened in this context can be a positive thing. For example, and on the slide it talks about mothers who have lifted a car to save their child. My father was actually saved by my grandmother, who lifted a car off of him during a car accident. But they can also be negative. For example, when you're walking down the street and you see a person of color walking and you feel like you need to move to the other side of the street, or you want to avoid any kind of interaction or contact with that person. Next. So people with diagnosed phobias of spiders have higher levels of amygdala activation in their brains. And when they view pictures of fear triggers like the snake or the spider, then we're able to witness and see the amygdala activate in their brain, usually through CAT scans. And so the level of amygdala activation correlated to subject performance on the racial implicit association test found that nationwide, 70 to 87% of people demonstrate bias against African Americans on the race IAT. And again, this was done by looking at and studying participants who were shown images of African Americans while they're under the CAT scan. And it showed the firing up of the amygdala in their brains. And so this is a telling piece about some of the implicit racial biases that a lot of us carry with us from day to day. Next. So now back to our memory task. I have a poll for you. I want you to basically try to remember which words you saw previously. Next. 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 So if you would, fill out this poll that should populate shortly.
All right, folks are filling out the poll. And I'll wait till we get most of the people to fill it out. Your joke was very funny. I was just muted, so you couldn't hear me laughing about your dog. All right, it looks like about 75 people have voted. I'll let more people vote. All right, we'll give it a minute. We've got 10 more seconds. All right, and you can see the results.
So interestingly enough, somebody filled in, well, a lot of folks, 55% of folks responded that sleep was there. 10% responded that snack was there. And neither of those words were there. So that test was to kind of show the ways in which we can easily form stereotypes or assumptions about what to expect based off of what we've been or received previously. So that's kind of a leading exercise in trying to propagate a whole bunch of words that seemed or sounded like sleep or dream or snooze or rest. They were associated with the same activity, but in actuality it wasn't present. Sleep, that is. And snack was very off, but some people or someone, I'm not going to name any names, responded that they saw snack. So now I'm going to hand it over to Zabrina, who's going to continue on with our presentation.
All right. Hi, folks. We're glad that you all joined us this afternoon. I get to talk about sort of the crossover between these kind of issues and legal trends that we see, or legal problems and issues that we see that manifest in large degrees of racial disproportionality in a lot of the systems that we're working in, and that also just in general result in a lack of equity, especially when it comes to students, but we're going to kind of talk in more general terms initially. So what we really pay attention to from sort of a legal and policy standpoint is how racially disparate outcomes are often a result of laws or policies that seem race neutral on their face, but actually allow a great amount of discretion in how those laws or policies are applied. And because of sort of the pervasiveness of implicit bias and these other sort of below, subconscious, below the surface prejudices and biases and influences in our perception, when we as humans are left to make very discretionary decisions, then that is where we see the most pronounced rates of racial disproportionality. So just to give some examples, there have been social science studies that have shown racial disproportionality in terms of equal access to housing. We can sort of understand that in the context of like the application process, so that if someone is applying, putting in an application for an apartment or a house, studies have shown that based on the person's name and whether or not their name sort of flags that they are of a certain race, or the person's voice on a voicemail, that then is related to whether or not the person is denied or approved for a housing application. So that's an example of sort of a race neutral on paper, but really discretionary in practice, kind of a rule. Employment, there's a very similar kind of pattern that happens in terms of access to employment, as well as issues around promotion and whose work is seen as most valuable or not. There's a social science study about a job applicant in particular who his real name was Jose, and he noticed that he was not getting a lot of job interviews or responses to application, but when he changed his name to Joe, he got tremendously more positive results in terms of his job applications. Medical treatment, there's also been a number of studies that have shown racial disproportionality, in particular with regard to whether or not protocols are followed when it comes to African American patients in particular. and where physicians' discretion can enter the picture, that African American patients in particular are not given the same level of medical care. And a big area under study has also been about undertreatment of pain with African American patients in particular, and that goes to some themes around lack of empathy for assuming that people don't feel as much pain as they do, or not appropriately responding with compassion to give people sufficient pain medication where they might be reporting significant amounts of that. So criminal justice, we all know a great deal around racial disproportionality in the system, and when we look at the discretionary areas, there's room for discretion all along the way that feeds into a very unequal treatment of African American and Latino people in the criminal justice system, and that could be from who gets arrested, who gets stopped and frisked, who gets charged with what level of offense, and of course sentencing involves a great deal of discretion as well. Within the education context, as we all know, willful defiance has been one of the most problematic areas of suspension and previously allowed for expulsion. And part of the reason that getting rid of willful defiance has been such a top priority for so many of us has been because that's where the greatest racial disproportionality has been seen in terms of suspensions and expulsions being unfairly meted out against students of color. If we go to the next slide, we just have some more images to sort of hit home how all of these patterns really do result in a school-to-prison pipeline, and that we see youth of color disciplined at significantly higher rates than white students and Asian American students. And we all know how much harm both suspension, expulsion, and also delinquency, incarceration have on young people and their prospects for the future. And again, so many discretionary patterns about who gets labeled a juvenile delinquent and how behaviors might be viewed as more serious depending on, or more threatening depending on the young person's race. The next slide shows a study by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt and Dr. Jason Okonofua, who happens to be here with us. So he has promised that he would chime in a little bit as I go into uncharted territory of trying to describe his study. We have found this study very interesting because it essentially was a study where teachers were given the same fact pattern, but what varied depending on the fact pattern they were given is whether or not the student in the fact pattern had a stereotypically black name, specifically like Deshaun or Darnell, or a stereotypically white name like Greg or Jake. And then the teachers were given these hypotheticals about how much they would feel troubled by or how much they would institute disciplinary action if that student displayed insubordination or classroom disturbance. And so teachers were then, asked to fill out their form of how troubled they felt or how much disciplinary action. And there was slight racial disproportionality when they were given a fact pattern about the first infraction. But then once they were given a hypothetical about a second infraction with similar behavior of insubordination and classroom disturbance, which notably are fairly discretionary categories in terms of what kind of behavior specifically would constitute insubordination or classroom disturbance, we see then, if you look at the second chart and then the fourth, or the bar graphs, Jason's correcting me, second and fourth bar graphs, then we see the racial disproportionality be very distinct in terms of black students being subjected to higher level of disciplinary action, and the teachers reporting feeling more troubled by the second infraction by black students. So, so as I've heard Jason talk about this, it involves sort of an escalation factor where discretionary judgments then become more severe against African American students.
And an additional takeaway from the study, in addition to the disproportionate discipline that teachers wanted to give these children based off of just 2 instances of misbehavior, is that we also asked teachers how likely it was that they would label the child a troublemaker. And they were significantly more likely to want to label the child a troublemaker if the child was black. And so this is where implicit bias comes in, because there's a stereotype, and this is speaking to that stereotype, that black people in general are more aggressive and hostile, and if you put it in a school context, that they're more likely to be troublemakers. And so then we could look at that statistically, and we found that sure enough, it was the extent to which teachers thought the child was a troublemaker is what in turn led them to want to discipline children more severely. And then on another level, that label troublemaker, what it did is it communicated that this misbehavior was indicative of a pattern. And so that may be a function of stereotyping and implicit bias at large, such that it can serve as glue that sticks together to unrelated incidents and makes it look like a more severe overall pattern. And then in turn, we see the disproportionate effect. And so we'll return to that label, that labeling process of how the troublemaker stereotype works when we start talking about the solutions. But that is a strong additional takeaway of that work.
Thank you, Jason. Also, just, you know, we've probably all heard teachers or principals or assistant principals refer to students as frequent flyers, so that to me just is what came to mind as Jason was speaking. So what can we do? These are daunting problems, and in our next few slides we'll actually give some suggestions about how to meaningfully and genuinely address issues of implicit bias and stereotyping. I had the privilege of hearing John Powell speak recently, who's an expert in this area at UC Berkeley at the Haas Institute, and he was talking about how that we can understand that implicit bias, you know, happens, and we also want to make sure that we also understand this is part of being a human, and that the goal here is not necessarily to eradicate ourselves, eradicate implicit bias from our psyches. And so there's, you know, there might be a little bit of a misleading message if we say dismantling implicit bias, although we do want to reduce the harmful effects of implicit bias. And in particular, it might be more helpful to think about this as how do we navigate our implicit bias, or how do we mediate our implicit bias so that our behavior and our relationships are more in line with the belief system we would, you know, like to have as we live through our lives. So we have some suggestions about how to navigate our implicit bias. Developing self-awareness, of course, is the first place to start. And for those of us who have taken the IAT tests, and I can say that it was very illustrative to take an IAT test. It's, of course, a vulnerable thing to do. You do it anonymously, though, and you can only see your own results for yourself. And it definitely brings up a lot of awareness and slows, it sort of catches the subtle subconscious processes and judgments that we make in a way that's sort of hard to in an abstract way, and so the IAT can be a way to really engage with how those biases feel and seem. And really being open about these issues is key. Another great clinician and practitioner, Alison Briscoe-Smith, talks about the importance of just talking about race, and how especially with children, giving children the message that it's important to just ask your questions and be open and have a dialogue, even if you're not always going to get everything right, that actually reduces implicit bias in the long run, and that keeping quiet or being afraid of saying something wrong or being afraid of being offensive actually defeats the purpose and can keep our implicit bias actually pretty tenacious. So motivation, we all clearly are motivated because you're on this webinar. So way to go, folks. And, you know, continuing to, you know, find things that are interesting that kind of help us develop our own awareness, and diverse relationships can be really key. And so we do encourage folks to also think about being proactive, to not sort of be like, oh, well, I have the analysis, so I'll just figure it out and I'll be, you know, a good non-racist, anti-racist person. There are important ways for us to actually pay attention to what kind of information we take in, how we do interact in situations of diversity or difference, and to really, as much as possible, be conscious of proactively resisting against the implicit bias that we all are inundated with on a daily, if not hourly, basis. So, so here's some concrete suggestions about how to be proactive. The next slide. All right, so debiasing interventions often involve contact with people we are not similar to. And so some guidance around, this has been to focus on actually ways that there are bridges between those of us and between us and people who are different than us. So there's some guidance here focused on similarities between yourself and the group that you have identified that you might have some bias against, and that can go a long way. This is different than not seeing color, and this is also different than saying, oh, we're really all the same. What we're really encouraging is more of a move toward empathy in the context of difference and diversity. So understanding people's different contexts and acknowledging that, and also relating across the bridges. There are some specific strategies that were developed by this guy Divine, who Jason is now going to let us know who Divine is.
Patricia Divine.
Oh, gee, see, I got it completely wrong. That was such a good example of implicit bias.
But Patricia Divine is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she is the person who really got the psychology field to start thinking about such things as implicit bias. And so before we had an IAT, she looked at how bias can happen automatically or beyond our awareness, which is pretty much the essence of implicit bias. And with her work, and so that was work she did back in 1989, and her work since then has really tried to look at how one can offset those type of biases. And so these are 5 strategies that she came up with that have been found to help.
All right, so we're going to go through them one by one. The first is stereotype replacement. And so that is recognizing that there are stereotypes that are around us constantly, and that we have really internalized. And if we identify them, but then look toward replacing those images with non-stereotypic, i.e. more positive and strengths-based responses, that actually has been shown to reduce levels of implicit bias. And so one example is a screensaver, like with positive images of a usually maligned group, and making sure that we really pay attention to the ways that popular media often does reinforce so many types of implicit bias. And so kind of being selective about the content of media that we expose our to can be helpful in terms of being aware of those effects. So you can go to the second of the next 2 slides, actually, the counter stereotypic imaging. And with respect to this sort of issue about being selective of what we expose ourselves to, I actually remember when I first heard Jason's presentation, Dr. Okonofua's presentation, he talked about a study that implicit bias increased just from sort of a few hours of TV watching, of regular mainstream TV, which was alarming to me, and also just sort of made me think about, oh my God, like what am I putting in my brain? So counter stereotypic imaging is a little bit of a sort of another, to me it seems like another version of stereotype replacement, but really is to make sure that we are replacing those stereotypes with ones that are kind of opposite of what we usually see. And so what I'd actually like to invite folks to do is think of some examples, and you will get bonus points of some form if you type in your comment area what your examples would be, and then we'll give you some great recognition at the end of this webinar. So one example that I've thought of in terms of the counter stereotypic imaging is like a list of children's books that has girl protagonists. It's called amightygirl.com. And that seems to be a good example. But if you folks have other suggestions, we would really love to hear them. Next is individuating. And so that is, specifically instead of relying on stereotypic ideas about people or conclusions or labels, to instead really view others according to their personal circumstances and characteristics. And so this would be, sort of catching ourselves when we think we see a pattern or stereotyping, and seeing the person in their context. A lot of this involves sort of personal humility to kind of acknowledge where we might have been engaging in stereotyping instead of individuating. So in the spirit of that, I'll give an example of when I was walking around San Francisco one day in November, remember it, and there was a disheveled man who kind of was walking toward and past me, who I assumed had said something sort of off-putting or offensive to me. And as I walked past him and away from him, I realized he'd actually said Happy Thanksgiving. It was Thanksgiving Day. So that to me was just like a moment of, oh my God, the ways that I was maybe engaging in stereotyping versus really taking the person for who they really are. Next, we've got perspective taking. And so that would be adopting the perspective of the person in their own first-person experience as a member of a stigmatized group. And this really gets to empathy, which Jason is going to talk about more, but really standing in the shoes of a person before assuming the worst of them. So for example, in a school situation, maybe a student who seems really angry might have been having a more stressful day than one could imagine earlier in the day. And so kind of catching ourselves before we assume that we understand, but being curious about what might have actually been really going on for that person. And obviously these are sort of characteristics of being a good human being in general, but maybe if we pay more attention to them, we will get even better at being these good human beings. And so increased contact is the last one. Next slide. And that's really being vulnerable and, increasing our contact and exposure with out-group members, and letting yourself be the maybe awkward only white person in the room, in my situation, or just making sure that we're not always sort of taking comfort in being around the people who we know best and sort of feel quote-unquote most comfortable around. Those kind of relationships can really do so much to advancing the kind of goals that we're all trying to work toward on a personal level. But then looking toward our institutions, so we also want to obviously always approach these issues from a systemic level. So for the next slide, I've just got some sort of points about identifying policies, practices, and laws that allow this kind of discretionary decision making that we have found to be so problematic when it comes to racial discrimination. And changing those laws, really making sure that our laws and policies and rules are more articulated so that we make sure that we can counteract the negative effects of the kind of biases that we're talking about. EJS does this through litigation, and so we take on sets of laws and institutions that are operating in this more discretionary manner, and we are able to bring in the insights of social scientists as experts in our cases to really illustrate the problematic nature of these kind of overly discretionary processes. So to the extent you could support any of the kind of lawsuits that are going on in your area, that always helps. And outside the legal context, just making sure that our own institutions and organizations are seeking to be aware of these issues and counteract the way that implicit bias may be affecting everyone within the organization and who the organization serves. So those are our sort of practical tips and approaches within sort of a legal framework. And now we're very, very happy that we've been joined by Dr. Jason Okonofua, who will go into more detail about the classroom setting and in particular emerging practices that have been shown to create more racial equity in the classroom and more compassionate approaches to students. So thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Zabrina. So now I'm going to talk about some of the cutting-edge research that we have that we have found to do some work to offset the school-to-prison pipeline. I can say now that where we are now, we're also working on ways to enhance the prison-to-school pipeline the other direction, in which we want to ease juvenile offenders' transitions back into school and reduce recidivism. But today, along with what we're talking about, the school-to-prison pipeline, the way that that pipeline begins is implied in the name, school, and so in the classroom. And so what I'll be talking about today is the relationship between teachers and students, how that can go awry, and how we can go about making that go or making that turn out in a more productive way. And so, next slide. Just to put more, a little more specifics on the statistics that we have today, the green bars, or the green bar are,
green bar, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I just forgot what the green bar is. What we're looking at is the difference in suspensions over the last several years, and what we see is that there has been a almost a tripling. Yeah, it is tripled. Tripled the amount of students who are being suspended from school. It's gone from 1.7 million to 5 million. A lot of research around it has suggested that this has to do with zero tolerance policies that have been taking place during the same period. But basically these policies, and I'll tell you why, have made the school environment more punitive, or disciplinary action more punitive. Namely, suspensions are happening at an increased rate for things that aren't exactly objective. And so as Zabrina was talking about, the most common reasons for suspensions are actually insubordination or willful defiance, which is not bringing guns to school. It is not sexual harassment. It is not bringing drugs to school. It is actually something that's very subjective in nature. And what we know about stereotypes is that the effects of bias really take shape or take a hold of our decision making when we're in contexts that are ambiguous. And so that really gives us an idea that indeed stereotyping and implicit bias will be shaping suspensions, and it looks like it's most commonly the case. And so that can speak to what we are seeing in the suspension rates. And so next slide. What we're looking at here is these same statistics but broken down by race, and there's two things to notice. The first thing to notice is that if you just look at the gray bars, you see that on average black students are more likely to be suspended than white students. But then when you look at those gray bars compared to the green bars, that's the disproportionality. That's what it's actually, it's not just that black students are more likely to be suspended, it's that they're 3 to 6 times as likely to be suspended than their white peers. There is a gender component to this as well that I have not graphed, but actually the difference between black girls and black girls and white girls is much larger than the difference between black boys and white boys. I'll go into more of that when I talk about the ways that we've gone about addressing this psychologically. And so when looking at this graph, the literature has been basically fallen into 2 separate camps. And so looking at the statistics in and of itself is looking at a correlation. And what we know about correlations is that it does not equal causation. This does not necessarily say what the cause of this issue is. And so many people look at how implicit bias, in fact, shapes teachers' perceptions of misbehavior, and that guides the way that they suspend students, such that they're more likely to want to suspend black students compared to white students. Another body of literature looks at how people from different racial backgrounds behave in different ways, and that research has really posited or suggested that black students are behaving more unruly or less interested in cooperating in class, and that's the reason why they are being suspended at disproportionate rates. And so up until recently, that's pretty much what we had, was a lot of theory that went along both of those directions. What I'm going to talk about today is how in my work I brought together those 2 literatures and considered how both a teacher's perspective and a student's perspective can feed into this disproportionate discipline. and that if we look at both perspectives or predicaments as a whole, we might have a better chance of offsetting this disproportionate discipline. And so just to put more paint on the canvas there, I'll tell you about what I did in putting together this theory. And so next slide. I went back to the literature and found that disciplinary problems are consequential for both teachers and students. I think there's animation on this slide, so yeah, there we go. For teachers, it can hinder them from maintaining control over their classroom, and it can dishearten them and increase the likelihood of attrition, and teacher attrition is a huge issue across the country. And in research done a few years ago, they surveyed teachers and asked why they left the profession, and many of them said that the reason why they left the profession was because misbehavior got in the way of them doing what they got into the profession to do in the first place, which was to reach kids with a mission to help them grow into responsible adults, but that when students misbehaved, it became increasingly difficult for them to do that, and so they left. And then for students, it can cause disengagement from school or alienation. It can lead them to feel like school is not a place where they belong or a place where they can get a fair shot in life. And ultimately, this can lead to dropouts and incarceration, which are two things that we see on a large scale and things that affect or disproportionately affect racially stigmatized students, and so Black students, Latino students, as well as Native American students. Next slide. And so based on thinking about both teachers and students' perspective, I built on previous research that I had done before. Namely, the research that we were talking about earlier that I did with Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt showed that stereotypes can shape teachers' perceptions of misbehavior, and in turn that can lead them to want to treat discipline students more severely, and that this is because they see Black students as more likely to be troublemakers. On the other side, that the way I did some separate research, and I didn't put up slides on this research because it actually hasn't been published yet. It's currently under review at a journal, but it's likely to be published. And so what we found is that I went and looked at nationally representative data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and in this data, I was able to look at how respected students feel by their teachers. And so what I found is that there was an interaction of socioeconomic status and whether or not a person was from a racially stigmatized group. And namely, on average, Black and Latino students felt like their teachers respected them less than their white and Asian peers felt. And that, interestingly, socioeconomic status mattered for white and Asian students, such that the higher their household income, the more respected they felt by teachers. However, for Black and Latino students, it didn't matter how much or how high or low their socioeconomic status was. They were still feeling like they were not being respected by teachers. And so as a whole, and so then based on other research that we're aware of, when any people feel like they're not being treated fairly in a context or not feeling like they're not being respected by the authorities in that context, that it is more likely that they're not going to want to be a part of that context. They're not going to want to cooperate with things going on in that context. A lot of this is surrounded from research on stereotype threat, which posits that when people fear that they're going to confirm a negative stereotype about their group, or when people feel like they're going to be the victims of discrimination, that they become less interested in that context. They disengage from that context. It can lead to underperformance as well as a lack of interest in a topic at hand. And so putting that together with the data I was just telling you about, that could explain how and why students from racially stigmatized groups might feel less inclined to cooperate with a given context if they do in fact feel like they're being treated unfairly due to their race. And so I put that research together into a single model that I'm going to explain to you now in a more a way that's easier to digest, and I'm going to put it into an example. And so let's imagine a child. This child's named Darnell. Darnell really enjoys science. He wants to be an astronaut when he grows up. And so he goes to school with a goal and mission to learn as much as he can about science so that he can ultimately become an astronaut. And then let's imagine a teacher. Let's call her Miss Smith. Miss Smith became a teacher because she really wanted to help students grow and learn, and that she was particularly interested in helping students who were at risk of not getting what they needed out of an education, because she really wanted to make a change in the world. I posit that stereotypes, which are in the air, that we can get from the media or we can get from just watching nonverbal cues around us, lead both of these people to be aware, or not aware, but just that they're exposed to the stereotype that black children are more likely to be troublemakers, and that this exposure leads both of them to think differently about one another, and it basically deteriorates their relationship, and in turn creates a barrier between them and the goals that they actually set out to get out of the classroom. And so here's where I like to say, what I'm saying is that, and this is part of the theory, that while there are in fact, or I do imagine that there are in fact many teachers who are in fact, do in fact show explicit bias and purposefully treat students differently according to their race, I'm assuming that most teachers in the world, in the country, actually have well intentions and really want to help children. However, the way implicit bias works is that it works below the surface, and so even well-intentioned teachers can then become a part of this process. And so, next slide. We can imagine that Darnell might feel, or Darnell might misbehave in class one day, whether it be walking around the classroom to throw things away, or talking in the back of the classroom, you know, things that any one of us did when we were younger. Next, well, it's going to be animation now, so next animation. And so that misbehavior by Darnell, because he is a black child, might lead the teacher to feel like this student this misbehavior is particularly severe, and therefore, next animation, the teacher might punish Darnell more severely than she punishes other students. Next animation. In turn, this might confirm in Darnell's mind that he is in fact going to be treated unfairly, and therefore Darnell becomes less interested in cooperating in class. Next animation. And so he's less inclined to participate in a given activity. Next animation. In turn, this may lead Ms. Smith, or confirm in Ms. Smith's mind, that Darnell is a troublemaker and that this is going to be a pattern of misbehavior. Next animation. And so in turn, she then disciplines Darnell even more severely. Next animation. And go ahead and go through 3 of them. And as you can see, over time, oh, back one. Yeah. Over time, these mindsets can shape each of their behaviors such that one person's mindset feeds on another person's mindset in the fashion of a recursive cycle or a feedback loop in which small or minor infractions ultimately become major infractions. And over the course of a school year, we can see how the relationship ultimately deteriorates, and neither one of these parties get what they want out of that classroom experience. And so what I want to focus on with these solutions that we have found are the yellow arrows here, and those arrows are places where subjective interpretation takes place, and so that's where we're making attributions about the world based upon our own mindsets. And in psychology, that's really where we can understand or break down what's happening there, but then also treat those as levers that we can shift to then change the outcomes of said relationships. And so next slide, I'm going to start with that top arrow and look at how we may be able to shift teachers' mindsets, and in turn how that may shift students' mindsets. And so the theory here is that exclusionary discipline arises from deteriorating teacher-student relationships, and so then by refocusing discipline or misbehavior as an opportunity to nurture a better relationship with students, that this in turn can reduce suspension rates. And I called this process or intervention, I called this empathic discipline, but that will make more sense in a moment. Next slide. And so the first step I wanted to take was to see if it is in fact possible to refocus teachers' mindsets to be more empathetic. And so I, next slide, recruited teachers from across the country who are currently practicing in schools in America to an experiment like the one that Zabrina was talking about earlier. And so like that experiment, teachers are told to imagine themselves as teachers in a particular school, and then they are shown instance of a student misbehaving. However, this time, before they saw the misbehavior, half of the teachers read about empathy and the other half of the teachers read about punishment. Next slide. And so half of the teachers read about how good teacher-student relationships are critical for students to learn self-control in the classroom at times. I assure you it wasn't just a sentence, but rather it was an entire activity in which they read an article about how this is the case, and then they engaged with the article. They responded to questions like, so then tell us, in your experience, how have good teacher-student relationships improved students' behavior? And likewise, the other half of teachers read an article about how punishment is critical for students to learn self-control, and that they then wrote about how that is in fact the case and how they have had experiences with that. In both conditions, teachers were able to generate ways that either one of these things were true, which speaks to, like I was talking about earlier, the punitive nature that takes place in school, but then also it speaks to how empathy is something that teachers are aware of, and that will make more sense later when I talk about the actual intervention. Next slide. And so after teachers read about the misbehavior, this time we didn't manipulate the student's race. All teachers read about a black child. But we wanted to see, is it possible to in fact make it less likely that teachers will label this child a troublemaker? And sure enough, when teachers engaged with the materials that talked about how empathy is important, teachers were much less likely, significantly less likely, to want to label that child a troublemaker. And so we're able to shift teachers' mindsets in this way, but we also wanted to know how can, or how does this change the way that teachers would actually respond to misbehavior. And so this time in this experiment, we just asked teachers in an open-ended question, what would you do? How would you respond to this misbehavior? What type of disciplinary practices would you enact in this situation? And so I then had judges or raters who were blind to the purpose of this relationship and our hypothesis, had them look for themes in teachers' responses, and they were able to find 5 themes, typical things that teachers were saying. I then went back and looked at, by condition, which teachers were more likely to do which themes. Next slide. And what we found is that when teachers, or what we found is that teachers who had read and engaged with the empathic mindset, they were less likely to want to threaten the student. They were less likely to want to assign detention to the student. They were less likely to want to involve the principal or send the student to the office for what would be something like a suspension or expulsion. However, they were more likely, next animation, to want to ask the student, why are you misbehaving? And they were also more likely to adjust the context. And so, for example, one of the misbehaviors was the child was walking around the classroom to throw away paper in a way that was distracting other students, and that's something that is classified as a classroom disturbance, which is the second largest or second most frequent reason for sending students to the office. Teachers who received the empathic message were more likely to say things like, I would move the student's desk closer to the wastebasket, or I would move the wastebasket closer to the student's desk. And so that is what we are calling empathy, because that is addressing the context as opposed to the child. That is making the context more conducive to better behavior as opposed to directly trying to do something to the child. And so it looks like in a scalable way, we can in fact change or refocus teachers' mindsets about misbehavior in a way that leads to discipline that's more empathetic. But along with the theory that I just walked you all through, I didn't want to stop there. It was important to also consider the students' perspective and consider how much respect students would feel. And so, next slide. Wanted to look at that other arrow, and so students' subjective interpretation of the discipline that they receive from teachers. Next slide. And so now I recruited a little over 300 participants to pretty much do the same thing that was done in the last experiment. However, this time we're looking at the student's perspective, and so rewrote the misbehaviors to be from the perspective of the students and wanted to find out just how they felt about it. And so to do this, next slide, I made two different conditions, and so in the control condition or the punitive condition, I took the exact responses that we received in that last experiment and inserted them in this scenario. Namely, Ms. Smith assigns detention to the child and threatens to send the child to the office, and then also indeed has that child talk to the principal. And so those are the things that, in fact, the teachers with a punitive mindset said that they would do. Alternatively, the other half of these students read about the same infraction, but this time Ms. Smith asked them why they were moving around the classroom, and then Ms. Smith rearranges the room so that the wastebasket and tissue box are closer to the student's desk. And so now we're going to see how, in fact, would a child respond to these different types of discipline. Next slide. And what we found is that that students felt much more respect for the teacher if the teacher responded to them in that empathic way. Next slide. They were also significantly more likely or more motivated to want to behave well in this classroom. Next slide. And they were more motivated to want to follow the rules that this teacher put forward. And so, next slide. We then did what we call a mediation analysis, but it basically allows us to see what exactly is happening with this data in a process. And what it is that the teacher's mindset, a teacher having more empathy, led the student to feel more respect, and in turn, that led the student to want to behave well in that class. And so the very interesting thing that's going on here that is not typical in research and is, it looks like we're looking at a new frontier in this type of intervention work, is that one person's mindset can transfer to another person's mindset. A teacher's empathy can turn into a student's respect, and in turn, and together with a better relationship, we can then get rid of the misbehavior in the first place, in addition to getting rid of the suspension rates. Next slide. And so those were lab experiments, but I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to see how can this play out in the real world. And so I designed a psychological intervention to test this. Next slide. And I ran this intervention with 5 middle schools across 3 different school districts. It was a pretty diverse sample of teachers and students. Next slide. And what I did is set up a 2-part program. In the fall, teachers participated in this online module at their own leisure within a 2-week window. And in this 45 minutes, they did some activities that I'm going to tell you more about in a moment. And then they did this again in the winter, but this time it was just for 25 minutes. Again, it's online, and that speaks to how scalable this can be. And they just completed some activities. And then at the end of the school year, I then collected all of the suspension records at all of these different schools. And so the experimental nature here is that half of the teachers in these 2 sessions, half of the teachers read about and completed activities around how technology is useful to get student engagement in the classroom, such as using PowerPoints and doing homework assignments that involve students using the internet, that this type of technology would get students more engaged in classroom materials. And so that served as a control condition because we assume that this is information that all teachers already know. And so it wouldn't change what is already the case. And also, it does have to do with teacher-student relationships. It doesn't have anything to do with empathy, but it does have to do with how teachers can communicate better with students. But what it didn't do is, in fact, talk about empathy. And so then the other half of teachers did the same type of activities, except these teachers read about how empathy is important. Next slide. They read about how relationships with students can help them. And you can go ahead and go through all the animations on this slide. It talked about, it allowed teachers to humanize students and think about students' perspectives. It talked about, at this point, how at this point in development, students really crave respect and care, and that this is how they learn how to navigate the world and how to communicate with adults, and that teachers are in a unique position to show students this type of support and show students how to successfully navigate relationships with adults. And so I want to note here that this is a psychological intervention, not a policy intervention. We did not tell teachers that they shouldn't suspend students. We did not tell teachers exactly how they should interact with students, but rather what we focused on is a shift in what teachers thought and how teachers, their mindsets around misbehavior in the first place. And we assumed that teachers would then have their own toolkits. They would have their own ideas about how to go about being more empathic to students. And that's a part of the materials. We asked teachers how they would go about doing this. And so before showing the results of this intervention, I just want to talk a little bit more about how these messages were delivered, because actually, again, what you're seeing on the screen right now, I do not suspect that this is new to teachers. I do not suspect that these are things that teachers did not know, but a lot of this has to do with mindsets and how we can get wrapped up in a certain way of thinking, and that can change how we respond to people. And so that relates to the activity that Chris walked you through, in which our mindsets just led us to think that sleep was one of the words that we saw, because all the other words had to do with sleep. However, that wasn't the reality. And so ways that we went about changing this mindset, next slide, is, for example, we had teachers read narrations or stories from students' perspectives. Next slide. And the thing to notice is that this child is talking about how at first he didn't feel like he belonged, and that this led him to get into trouble. However, when a teacher sat down with him and really listened to him, he then and told him about how he too got in trouble and how things could get better, that he then felt like he could actually belong in school and could have more trust in school. And so this is doing a number of things. It's creating a norm. It's showing that this is something that a lot of students can go through. It's also showing the humanity of children, because this is from the perspective of this child. It's also showing how empathy can, in fact, enact change in how students behave, because there's a process here in which the student didn't feel like they belonged, but then came to feel like they belonged when a teacher reached out to them. Next slide. Teachers also read some stories from a teacher's perspective. Next slide. And things to notice from the teacher's perspective is that the teacher is thinking back about how she felt or how she craved respect and trust from her teachers, and how now, as a teacher, she tries to show her students that respect in return. And so some things that's going on here is that it creates the norm for teachers, that it's normal to have to experience misbehavior, but that if you actually empathize with yourself, you do perspective taking with your younger self, you can actually think about how even you wanted to feel respected even when you misbehaved, or even especially when you misbehave. Thank you. Actually, can you go back a slide? One more thing to note, and it's very important about this process, is that this entire module was set up as an activity about getting teachers' perspectives. It was like communicating to them that I am I'm a researcher. I have only ever taught college students and inmates at San Quentin. I have never taught a K through 12 class, and that they knew more about how to interact with students than anyone else would, and that what we wanted to do is get their expert perspectives in order to put together materials for future teachers to help them navigate the teaching profession in a successful way. And so what that's doing, and this is what we call saying is believing, what that's doing is setting up a environment for teachers to both take this seriously, but then also setting up cognitive dissonance, because in these materials, they weren't just reading about empathy, but rather they were responding to a lot of questions about, so tell us, how do you use empathy in your classroom, or how would you like to use empathy in your classroom? And responding to questions like, please explain how using empathy can, in fact, help children do better in class. And they're all saying this from the perspective of this is going to be information that's going to be shared with teachers across the country. And so what that's doing is setting up cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a very well studied cognitive process that we all are we're all affected by. For example, cognitive dissonance is like the distance between what we're thinking and what we're doing. And basically, no one wants to be a hypocrite. And so, for example, if we think about a smoker knows that smoking is bad and that it's socially unacceptable these days. That's the cognition. That's what's in their mind. But they're still smoking, and so there's a distance or dissonance between what they're thinking and what they're doing. And so, what cognitive dissonance is that we try to reduce that distance or dissonance as best as we can, and it happens automatically, it happens beyond our awareness, or we do it on purpose. So that smoker may tell himself things like smoking leads to lung cancer, I don't know the exact percentage, but let's say 90% of the time. A smoker could then tell themselves, well, there's that 10%, and I'm that 10%, and so it's actually not that bad. Or a smoker could tell themselves things like, okay, smoking is bad, but so is eating hamburgers. That leads to heart disease, but we all do that anyway, so why don't I, what's wrong with me just doing this thing? But basically, we do a lot of work to reduce any type of dissonance or distance between what we are thinking and what we are doing. And so to bring that back to the current procedure, these teachers are then, in effect, publicly endorsing the message that empathy is important and that empathy helps in the face of conflict or misbehavior. And what this does is that it makes it possible that in the exact times when this message is needed, when a child is misbehaving, that it's more likely that they will have this mindset in their working memory than them having another mindset in their working memory, than them having a more punitive mindset. I said all of that, and I wanted to go through some of the procedures here because I wanted to make it clear that it's not just the content, it's not just empathy, but it's also about changing mindsets, and that took, psychological techniques, but it's changing the teacher's mindsets in a very targeted manner that led to, next slide, a 50% reduction in suspension rates across those school districts. And so, as you can probably see now, that is a huge effect. And so if you look at the gray bar, you're seeing what is pretty much, like I said earlier, 11% of the student population in the country is suspended. And so the control group, that is pretty much the same as what the percentage is or the rate is across the country. So first of all, it looks like our control group was in fact a control, and it does look like a punitive mindset is what we're looking at on a national level. And that what we're seeing is that it went from 9.6% to 4.8% of suspensions based upon just the shift in mindsets. I can tell you now, as it pertains to psychological interventions, that is a huge effect. As it pertains to policy interventions, that is a huge effect. And so let's just talk more about this effect. Next slide. And so one of the number one predictor of suspensions is a history of suspensions. Has the child been suspended before? Which is very similar to criminal justice. And so what we're seeing here, if you look at the two bars on the right, those are children who were suspended that previous year, the year before the intervention. And what we're seeing here is that regardless of whether or not students had a history of suspensions, this intervention made it less likely that that child would then be suspended going forward. Next slide. Something else we know and have been talking about today is that there's a gender and race component such that boys are much more likely to be suspended than girls, and that Black and Latino students are much more likely to be suspended than their white and Asian peers. And so let me break down this graph a little bit. The top two charts, the top two graphs are girls. The bottom two graphs are boys. The graphs on the left are white and Asian students. The graphs on the right are Black and Latino students. And so just to orient that a little bit, the top left those are white and Asian girls, and just like national data, they are the least likely to be suspended. And then if you look at the bottom right, that is Black and Latino boys, and like on national statistics, they are the most likely to be suspended. And what we're seeing here is that across all of these groups, this intervention led them to become less likely to be suspended. But while on this graph, I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality really quickly. I hinted at it before, such that yes, Black and Latino boys are by far the most likely to be suspended. However, the racial difference between Black and white is actually more stark when we look at girls. An interesting thing about this intervention is that while overall there was a 50% reduction in suspension rates, for Black and Latino girls, what you're seeing is a 75% reduction in suspension rates. And so this intervention seems to be particularly beneficial for Black and Latino girls. And so that's something I'm going to be looking at in future research, but I can say now that the theory I'm building around it, and a way that I see how this makes sense, is that a lot of past research has established that relationships, positive relationships with teachers, are more sought out and are more beneficial or pivotal for girls than they are for boys. And so if we consider that stereotypes about race are something that would affect both girls and boys, that an intervention that improves relationships would be particularly beneficial for girls, because positive relationships that they would then be missing out on due to their race can then be benefited. They can then become better, and therefore this works best for girls. Okay, and so then before I stop here, let's just touch on a little bit more of the processes that are taking place. And so next slide. We ask teachers an open-ended questions about their mindsets, and what we're reading here are some responses that we got from teachers who received the materials for more empathic mindsets. And they said things like, I never hold grudges. I try to remember that they are all the son or daughter of someone who loves them more than anything in the world. They are the light of someone's life. And so that, I mean, at least me, maybe you too, can see that's empathy. That's looking beyond that's looking beyond any type of stereotypes or any type of label, like this person is a troublemaker, and really humanizing the child, thinking about how this is an actual person. And so some of the strategies that Zabrina was talking about earlier from Patricia Devine had to do with perspective taking and individuation. That's what's going on here. This child is not being seen as a stereotype, but rather as the most beautiful thing in someone's life. Next slide. Something else that's happening here that's pretty interesting is that we also looked at students' perspectives, and so we wanted to know if this is in fact changing students' mindsets as well. Next animation. And so we asked children to indicate the extent to which they felt like teachers and other adults at their school treated them with respect. And so to orient you to this graph, the bars on the left are for children who do not have a history of misbehavior or a history of suspensions, and the bars on the right are children who do have a history of suspensions. And so like I said before, and if you look at the gray bars, students who have a history of being suspended, they are the at-risk students. And sure enough, for them, they felt like they were treated with less respect. And so that kind of makes sense. They had been suspended before. Now they feel like there's less respect for them at school. However, what this intervention did is that if we now look at the green bars, even if children had a history of suspensions, they still felt like teachers respected them. And so this kind of gets at, and so like I said, we didn't tell teachers not to suspend children. What we're seeing here is that even if they suspend children, it hasn't deteriorated the relationship. There is still a level of respect and trust that persists in the relationship. And I think that is an important takeaway on how we approach these type of disparities. And it speaks to the type of approach I took with this intervention, such that we didn't go directly at debiasing. We didn't go directly at trying to get teachers to not have implicit bias. But what we did is look at how we could reshape what they did with that implicit bias, how we could shape how so like we said earlier, implicit bias leads teachers to want to label children a troublemaker. How can we offset that troublemaker label in and of itself? And this speaks to what a psychological intervention can do, or thinking about mindsets. Because, for example, in California, there's about to be a ban, or I think it just started, on giving suspensions for willful defiance. That will definitely take down suspension rates. However, what we're not sure of is how that will get rid of the disproportionate discipline rates, but then also what that means for the relationship between teachers and students. And hearing from a lot of teachers, I mean, they feel like they may be losing a way to deal with misbehavior in their classroom without getting a new tool. And so I would posit that when we are thinking about offsetting disproportionality, that we should definitely think about these policies, and we should also think about the relationships in these classrooms, or the relationships amongst people, how mindsets can be shifted. Because something that I didn't mention, and I'll do this quickly before I end, is that for logistical reasons, we only did this intervention with math teachers at the school, because every student only has one math teacher, and every student has to have a math teacher. Therefore, we would be able to look at these statistics by whether a student had whether a student had a teacher in the control condition or the treatment condition. If we gave it to all teachers, for any given student, it could be that they had 2 teachers in the control condition and 4 in the treatment condition, and we wouldn't know what worked or how. So for logistical reasons, we just work with math teachers. But then I would urge you to look at this graph again, or to look at the other graphs again, and remember that these are overall suspension rates, or the graph we're looking at right now. This is how students feel about all the teachers and all the adults at their school. To put that a different way, by changing the mindset of just one teacher, it looks like it shifted the entire social experience for these children. By having one teacher who showed them empathy, students felt more respect and trust by that entire context, all teachers. Because what we know about suspensions, they happen in any given classroom, they happen in the hallway, they happen on the playground. And so when we look at a reduction in suspension rates, that has to do with all of those different contexts. And we sure enough went back and looked to see, are these results based on just the math teachers being less likely to suspend students? And so in one of the schools, from one of those school districts, they did record which teachers sent the students to the office for suspension. And what we found is that math teachers were only responsible for, overall, math teachers were only responsible for 17% of the suspensions that students received. And so that basically speaks to, it's actually definitely, or there's strong evidence that what we're seeing does not have to do with the math teacher being less likely to suspend a student, but rather that student's entire social experience had been shifted. And so, next slide. With the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to briefly touch on some other interventions like this that have been showing promise. I can say now that this current intervention is the only one that has been able to show such a large reduction in suspension rates, and the only one of this nature that has focused on discipline so far. However, next slide, there are interventions that have been found to reduce the racial achievement gap, and so looking at performance as opposed to discipline. Oh, is the next slide not in the deck? Okay, well, on the next slide, there was going to be...
Sorry, it seems like no, but yeah, I think this is as far as I had. But
that's fine. I can just talk.
Okay.
And so as it pertains to psychological interventions, again, there haven't been ones until this one that looked at discipline or suspension rates. However, there are interventions that have been found to indirectly offset the effects of implicit bias or stereotyping on academic achievement. And so one of these is by Carol Dweck, and it focuses on growth mindsets. Oh, there we are. And that basically gets at how if you encourage students to show more effort when they fail, that then leads them to persist more in the face of failure, and that has to do with the mindset that with effort you can in fact become better at something. That has been found to reduce disparities in the achievement gap. And Dr. Jeffrey Cohen has put together a values affirmation intervention that basically if a child is able to affirm their values in a school context, that can serve as a buffer against things like stereotype threat, such that students feel more power to achieve their goals in a context that might be threatening. Dr. David Yeager at the University of Texas put together an intervention on a sense of purpose, and that has found that if students feel more like they can value the school setting to get to their own goals and what's important to them, that can in fact offset disparities due to race and academic achievement. And then also Dr. Gregory Walton at Stanford put together a belonging intervention that it actually has now we've started to look at discipline with it on a paper we're putting together now, but by encouraging or giving examples of how children can come to how you might not feel like you belong at first, but over time you will make friends and you will feel like you belong, and that this will be a setting where you can feel comfortable. By shifting mindsets in that direction, that too can not only mitigate the racial achievement gap, but it may also be able to mitigate the discipline gap that we see. And so that's what we have as it pertains to psychological interventions. As you probably know, the go-to for addressing suspension rates, not necessarily disparities in suspension rates, but suspension rates, is positive behavioral intervention systems, PBIS, support systems, sorry, which, yeah, we're all familiar with. And what we know about it is that, you know, it's not like what I just showed you in the psychological intervention. Like I said, that was 45 minutes in one session, 25 minutes in another. Rather, it calls for a 3-tier system with behavior coaches and a number of processes and structures in place. They have shown a lot of promise in reducing suspensions, namely in elementary schools. But I'm not familiar in how well that directly can address implicit bias and racial disparities, but that is also a promising avenue that is being tested and that people can take today. Next slide. And I will just end there. Thank you. And I think now we're opening it up to questions.
Yeah, we're opening up for questions. Thank you so much. And definitely sorry about that mix-up with your last slide.
No worries.
And yes, I definitely wanted to piggyback that, you know, this work is really connected with, you know, the dismantling of bias is definitely very connected in schools with the implementation of restorative practices, trauma-informed practices, you know, positive behavior intervention and support. And so, you know, it's really helpful that we have this extra resource when those practices are being implemented in schools. And we have a number of questions. I have one question of my own. I was wondering what the eyes are on top of the graph. You had a couple of like sideways H's or eyes on the top. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what those are.
Yes, sorry. People have told me that I should take those off when it's a non-academic talk, but those are, for some of them, they're error bars. For other ones, they are confidence intervals. In either context, they're basically how we statistically determine if a difference is real or if it's due to chance, and that's based upon if those eyes overlap with different graphs or with different bars in the graph. And so, for example, when we looked at overall suspension rates that had been reduced by the intervention, the only thing to take away from those black lines is that they don't overlap. And so that means that it's a significant difference.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, and then the first question that I have was from, is for Zabrina. And it's about if there are templates or canned commentaries available for, well, no, I think it is for Jason. Templates or canned commentaries available for filling out CUME records or IEPs or 504s or referrals, because this participant is wondering how we begin to be proactive by having educators give just the facts, quotations, about student behavior rather than allowing subjectivity to color reports.
Right, okay, so I'm really appreciating that question because I actually had sort of skimmed over what I think is a great proactive strategy that sometimes judges use when they're looking at sentencing in the criminal justice context in particular, where if we want to proactively prevent our implicit bias from affecting our judgment, that it could, a judge uses a particular strategy of not having a picture of the defendant and not having a name of the defendant, but looking at the sentencing report just based on the facts. And so that's been shown to decrease levels of bias. And teachers can use that too. Just the limited teaching I've done to try to make sure that my own biases just toward or against individual students don't affect my grading. If you can anonymize and then look at that subjective content, that can be helpful. But this question is very interesting to me in terms of, how to look at referrals for special education in a way where bias wouldn't necessarily enter the picture. I suppose a school could institute a process of sort of anonymization when the decisions are then getting made. That's a little bit hard in some school contexts, but I could see a way where if there's multiple levels of review for that process, or maybe for a process of referring a student for expulsion in particular, that actually anonymizing the student's race, name, and things like that as the higher level decision makers are then reviewing a decision about recommending a student for expulsion. A resource that Jason just pulled up is www.projectimplicit.org. That's www.projectimplicit.org. And
I'm going to include that in the chat box so people can see that.
Thank you, Sarah. So that's a place to look for tools like that and strategies.
All right. And then we did get a couple of examples for the different ways to reduce bias that you spoke about, Zabrina. So we got an example of Oprah Winfrey and Black Girls Rock.
Oh yeah.
And we got those two examples. And then someone else noted that acknowledging privilege is also a vital function to reducing stereotypes.
Right.
And gave an example of allowing people from marginalized groups to take leadership roles or speak more than people who are more traditionally privileged or more privileged.
Yeah.
If you guys have anything to say about that.
That makes me think of that really helpful writing piece by a white woman whose name I'm forgetting, but it's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege. And I think sort of keeping like a running list like that, and also that's one thing to kind of acknowledge and talk about, right, in terms of encouraging dialogue around race, noticing it and pointing it out to those around us when we white folks in particular can tell that we've been, treated in a better way, or given some sort of benefit of the doubt, and all sorts of things like that. So those are really helpful. I also think of Dr. McStuffins, right? The little black girl doctor. She's another good counter stereotypic, image out there. So
yeah, yeah, I will. I can include that. I think it's Peggy McIntosh.
Thank you. Yes.
The knapsack.
Yeah.
And then, and actually, I don't know how you guys feel about this, and I know people sometimes feel, differently about BuzzFeed, but I did take one of those, checking your privilege quizzes, and there are like 100, kind of 100 of those different things in the, some of the things related to what's in the knapsack, where you can kind of, almost, checklist your own privilege. And so that, I wanted to note that for folks too.
Are you going to share that link for us so we can check it out?
Yes, I will.
Awesome.
Yeah, I will share it
That
out
sounds
for
great.
people too. And then there was another question about, and I think this refers to when Jason was talking about the kind of the negative feedback loop. Someone noted that this was a form of rational emotive behavior therapy that is used in counseling. And I don't know if, any of you have anything to say about that. I have never heard of that. So please do let me know if you have anything to respond about that.
It is definitely related to work in clinical psychology as well as marriage and family counseling. The closest thing to that as it pertains to social psychology and interventions is there is some work by Eli Finkel from Northwestern University that looked at romantic couples, married couples, and found that when couples can perspective take, and also when they can take a third-person perspective in context in which there's a deteriorating relationship, that the same type of process can be offset, that a negative feedback loop can turn into a positive one. But yeah, there's that work. It's definitely relevant.
Okay, great. And then someone else asked, does it make sense that newer teachers who are most likely to be placed in schools serving historically underserved populations would also see students as less capable or skilled, therefore affecting teacher preparedness?
Oh, that's interesting.
And could this also have the result of student disengagement and the feeling of being disrespected by teachers who are either not prepared to give rigorous instruction or not supported to do so?
I think that those are very possible, and there are also some hypotheses that I would share. However, I can say that we did want to look into that, the research I did with Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, and what another part of that research is it had to do with all the things that we controlled for when we got that effect. We controlled for things like for these teachers at their home school, what was the total student population, how many students were on free or reduced lunch, what was the average teacher-to-student ratio at their school. We also looked at what region of the country the teachers were coming from, as well as the levels of explicit bias they had, and so just how they felt about black people in general. But as it pertains to this topic, we asked teachers, and we had how many years they had been teachers. On average, it was 14 years, but there was a range of how much experience the teachers had. And that did not predict the, not only did that not predict the race effect that we saw on disproportionate discipline, but when we controlled for that, the race effect was still there. And so it's like above and beyond anything that would be due to how many years a teacher has been a teacher, that mindset still is there. And so all that to say, I do think that there's something, I still think that there's something, some type of effect for a teacher of how much experience that teacher has, as well as the training that that teacher has received. I'm not sure which direction that would go, such that maybe newer teachers do not know, or newer teachers are more likely to resort to stereotypes because, like I said, in ambiguous situations or in hectic situations, that's when implicit bias really shapes our decision making. And so for new teachers, it's their new time in this environment, there's a lot going on, and so they may resort to stereotypes. But then another thing that could be possibly happening is that over time, teachers can be becoming jaded due to the experiences that they have had. And so I would imagine that that would depend on what type of schools they have taught in, such that we do know a lot of the more experienced teachers that we have end up at predominantly white schools compared to predominantly black schools. And so I suspect that there's something going on there. I'm not sure which direction. And then the student aspect of what was just said, I think is very interesting. I do not know of research on it, but there may definitely be some in education. But the whole perception of this teacher either has no experience or it's not likely that this teacher is going to stay my teacher. for years to come, I would imagine that, I mean, children soak up more than we imagine. I do imagine that does affect how they feel about school as well as education at large.
I got a question kind of related to that. If I can jump in real quickly, I'm curious about how you square that with, for example, programs where teachers are expected to go into underserved or underprivileged populations like Teach for America, and how what assumptions might be brought out from kind of those programs which have mixed reviews. And it's not a diss to anybody who may be formerly TFA on the line.
I just also want to chime in, even separate from the issue about teacher preparedness or teachers' lower expectations maybe of students of color. There's another element that that is often at work that I heard Dr. Rachel Godsill speak about recently, about how teachers, especially white teachers, have been found to not grade students of color's writing as rigorously as they have in terms of grading and editing white students' work. And so what she was sort of describing that as was that some teachers are so afraid of being called racist that they sort of overcompensate in this weird way by then not actually challenging or correcting the work of students of color. And then those students are not getting the benefit of, really particularized critical feedback on their work, and are not able to then incorporate those kind of edits to better performance in the future, whereas they don't feel that kind of limitation on the kind of feedback that they could give to white students. So the very fear of being racist can often be a real harm, was my takeaway from that.
Yeah.
Can result in harm to students of color.
Yeah, thank you for that too. And I'm sorry, the reason I'm hemming and hawing is because I'm trying to look for other questions that I may have missed. But someone was noting that challenging it was a comment that challenging the punitive mindset is so critical, and often the way that new teachers consider that they've done their job is if they've done something to address the behavior rather than what is the reason the student is behaving that way, or what is the best way to address this need. And so that person is really thankful that you have added this critical research to this discussion. And I have a piggyback for that question as well, is as a policy advocate. So some people on this call are policy advocates, some people on this in this webinar are policy advocates, some people are educators, some people are academics, etc. And so some of us, I'm speaking from a policy person, a policy advocate's point of view, and I'm wondering, how does this research, some of it, become policy and not, or, how does some of it become the way that we prepare people to, challenge the punitive mindset and instead go towards the empathetic mindset?
So I can speak from what I try to do from, the researcher's perspective, and maybe my colleagues over here can speak more to the practitioner or policy side of it. But for me, the whole idea is to make it scalable. And so that was the whole thing about making all of these materials take the form of that it can be done online, it can be done at teachers' leisure, and then it not only does it not take up a lot of teachers' time, but it doesn't take up a lot of school time. It took away nothing from the school day. And so all of those things, I purposely wanted to look at it that way because it's important to make a small package in order to make it the most, useful to the largest number of people, such that an entire district, which was the case here, an entire district or districts can just implement it and then it's done. Ways to go about doing that from talking with other people is that you make it something that teachers can do to get certain benefits or incentives. You can make it such that when teachers have mandatory teacher development or professional development anyway, that they can just do this online activity instead of doing that. Because another aspect of it is that tried to make the materials enjoyable. It seems to be the case that teachers are not asked their perspectives very often, and so they were actually very happy to do this activity. And so if it's set up such that a teacher can do this instead of something that may come off as more of like a lecture or telling them to do certain things differently, that if they're able to like tell their side of the story, that they may opt into doing that. And so in all those ways are ways that I try to think about how to turn this into something that can be enacted on a policy level. But
yeah, I mean, I think about all the work that folks are trying to do with getting LCAP funding, like school district funding, redirected from more punitive approaches like police and schools to, in fact, giving more resources and staffing for PBIS and restorative justice and counseling staff, and just really, to me, it's so tough that teachers often are the scapegoats for these kind of patterns when they have the most impossible job. And I think that if we really did more to really shore up that support for teachers, and that's really about policy and how we channel our funding, then those kind of things could really make a huge difference in these areas.
Right. And then there was another question that came in about what is the overlap about this with university level bias against students in the classroom. And I should note for folks, a couple of people who have joined who are, university level educators or policymakers, that, most of the Pick School Discipline webinar series is about K through 12, because that's where, the focus of, my organization's work is in K through 12 policy. However, I'm hoping that some, Dr. Okonofua or Zabrina or Chris have some, ideas about, the overlap or, some ideas about university level bias against university students in the classroom.
So yeah, while the outcomes are a little different, because discipline on a college level is pretty different than discipline in like a middle school, for example, and the relationships that students have with their teachers versus relationships students have with their professors are also a little different. However, I would strongly expect or hypothesize that the same type of processes will be affecting those relationships just due to the relationship nature, such that there's a power dynamic. There's one person who's the superior and there's another person who's the subordinate, and that in those type of relationships that an empathic mindset can definitely offset a labeling process from taking place. And so that means not just the relationships between professors and their students, but also relationships between bosses and their employees, how managers manage their employees, or relationships between prison guards and prisoners, or high-ranking military officers and low-ranking military officers. In all these contexts, there's an ongoing relationship that takes place over time, and that there's a superior and a subordinate, and that superior has certain expectations for that subordinate's behavior. And I think that in any of those type of contexts, an empathic mindset will be very important. And I can also say now that, I mean, yeah, I'm going to do a little plug here. Yeah, I just started at the University of California Berkeley, and, so I'm starting to, put together new research projects, and that is something that I hope to look at. So if anyone has any funding that they want to put forward, we can do that work together.
Oh, wow.
That's
okay.
Great. That's great.
Great. I did not know that this webinar was going to be a networking opportunity.
Whatever works. There's also, I think, a good example of work that was done at University of Texas at Austin that I also heard John Powell talk about, where students of color were not doing well in terms of graduation rates and things like that, other indicators of success. And then the university put some dedicated resources into creating more of like a social circle network of support and mentorship for students of color, and their success rates went up dramatically. And so, he seemed to be touting that kind of work, so folks could look into what UT Austin did just to reduce isolation in particular. And acknowledge what folks' actual emotional experience was in those universities.
Yeah, I was just going to add basically the same point, which is a lot of the experiences that Black students or minority students are undergoing in their K through 12 experience is also very translatable to their experiences in college, whether at PWIs or maybe even other types of organizations or schools like HBCUs. But in particular, the feelings of isolation and not being able to connect. And so one of the things that EJS has been involved in, for example, is our second kind of amicus brief in the Fisher case, which is talking about affirmative action and the importance or the significance of just what we've talked about in this presentation, which is engaging in across the lines with out-group members or in-group members and opening our kind of perceptions of how we proceed to kind of foster a more inclusive community and society, and the actual results that are yielded from that experience, that inclusivity, which is greater understanding of each other, less feelings or fewer feelings of isolation, and more instances of group promotion that actually appears to be more beneficial when folks are actually stepping across the lines and engaging with out-group members or other group members. So a lot of these things might lessen in terms of discipline or punitive discipline experiences, but are actually very similar or on the same level with other social, emotional, life experience situations.
Great, thank you. And then someone else asked about like professional development materials and tools for school staff on reducing and or mediating implicit bias. If you have any recommendations, we can send, when we put together the, you can mention them now, but when we put together the PDF of this presentation, we could add the other materials that we, other resources that we listed. So the Peggy McIntosh, the checking your privilege, and a couple of different things, if you three would like.
That sounds awesome. That'd be great to give folks a toolkit right away.
Yeah. But yeah, if you would feel free to also mention any thoughts that you're having about other professional development things for K through 12 staff.
I know of, and so if you look at the bottom of some of my slides, you see something that says PERTS, P-E-R-T-S, and there's a site called perts.net, and they have this thing called the Mindset Toolkit, and that's basically a resource for teachers to better understand and do different activities and programs that have to do with refocusing mindsets. That's mostly, or to date, that's mostly about students' mindsets. But the research I just shared with you today, it will be available through that toolkit as well, I believe starting this fall. And so it's just a matter of going to the website, following a link, and one can set up professional development that way. Also, please feel free if there's any school or district or state that's interested, please include my email address. I'm still very open to working with programs individually or districts individually. But yeah, what I know for sure going forward is that if you go to this mindset toolkit, this information will be there, but then also things like the growth mindset work, the sense of purpose work, wise feedback, things like that that are useful for teachers as well. Those things, and so again, it'll be kind of similar such that it won't be specific debiasing techniques, but rather it be ways that address the disparities that we see while going after mindsets. And so, yeah.
And since Jason started it, us here at Equal Justice Society also do trainings on implicit bias for teachers and staff and a lot of different groups. And we're actually working with a lot of different professors, including Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith, on toolkits that we're in the process of developing currently. And so if you continue to stay connected to us, we'll be able to share those with you as well.
Shameless plug.
But also that's great. Thank you for both of you saying that. When that stuff is up and ready to go, please do let me know, because I, manage fixschooldiscipline.org, and so I'm happy to send out a notification to folks through this listserv and who were on this on this webinar here and our larger listserv about those resources. And then I think someone also said that there were a lot of restorative practices resources that can be found on healthiersf.org if people were interested more in restorative practices. And then I think, you know, I think that is the rest of the questions. Very many people saying that they, you know, are really happy about this webinar, thanking us for our time, and leaving the webinar with much reflection to be done, changes to be made, very appreciative, and I think, yeah, thanks for a fantastic webinar. So if there aren't any more questions, I want to really thank Zabrina, Chris, and Jason so much for their time. You know, I know a lot of work is put into this, and you guys were with me for 3 hours today, so I'm really, really, really thankful.
Thank you, Sarah, for doing such an expert job making it all happen and coordinating and figuring out all the content and how we got this together.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Yep.
So yeah, thanks. Maybe one day we'll meet in person.
That would be great.
All right, great. Well, then without further ado, I will let you all go into your evening. Thank you so much. And, you know, email us if you have any questions. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.